The first gunshot that tore through Fort Kearny's dusty Main Street sent Francine Shaw diving behind a water trough, clutching her sketching journal to her chest as her heart hammered against her ribs. Another ordinary Tuesday in Nebraska Territory, 1867, disrupted by men with too much whiskey and too little sense. "For heaven's sake," she muttered, brushing dust from her simple blue cotton dress. "Can a person not enjoy a peaceful morning in this town?" Fort Kearny had grown considerably in the 2 years since the war ended, transforming from a military outpost to a proper settlement along the Oregon Trail. The streets bustled with travelers, traders, and settlers, all seeking fortune or fresh starts in the West. Francine had come for neither. She'd arrived 6 months ago with her ailing father, a former doctor seeking the dry climate to ease his consumption. She peered cautiously over the trough. 2 men were being separated by the sheriff, a third nursing a bloody nose on the boardwalk. Nothing unusual. Her gaze drifted past them to a tall figure at the end of the street, and she felt her breath catch. Even from this distance, Beau Montgomery cut an imposing figure. His broad shoulders were draped in a dust-coated duster, dark hat pulled low over his eyes. He sat atop a magnificent chestnut stallion, seemingly untroubled by the commotion. Unlike the other men who'd scattered during the altercation, he hadn't moved an inch. "Cold as the winter mountains, that one," came a voice beside her. Francine turned to find Mrs. Wilcott, the milliner's wife, shaking her head disapprovingly. "I beg your pardon," Francine asked, rising to her feet and dusting herself off. "Montgomery. Been watching him ride in and out of town these 3 years. Never seen him smile once." Mrs. Wilcott clucked her tongue. "They say he worked for the Pinkerton Agency during the war. Some say he was a bounty hunter after. Whatever his past, that man's heart is stone. Mark my words." Francine watched as Montgomery dismounted in one fluid motion outside the general store, his movements economical and precise. "Perhaps he simply values his privacy," she offered. Mrs. Wilcott snorted. "Privacy is one thing, Miss Shaw, but that man, talk as he can't feel a thing. Shot 3 outlaws dead last spring when they tried to rob the stage. Didn't blink an eye afterward. Just collected the bounty and rode out." She lowered her voice. "They say his wife died in '63, childbirth, lost the baby too, never been the same since." Francine felt a pang of sympathy. "That would change anyone, I imagine." "Change, yes, but to shut off completely." Mrs. Wilcott shook her head. "Nature gave us hearts that break for a reason, Miss Shaw. A man who can't feel pain can't feel joy neither. Best remember that." Francine gathered her sketching materials, but her eyes were drawn back to Montgomery. She'd seen him around town occasionally since her arrival, but had never exchanged words with him. He worked one of the largest cattle spreads outside town, the Crescent Ridge Ranch, and rarely came in except for supplies or business. As if sensing her gaze, he turned slightly in her direction. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the dusty street. His were a startling blue against his sun-weathered face, betraying nothing. He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture so subtle she might have imagined it, before disappearing into the general store. "Seems polite enough to me," Francine remarked. Mrs. Wilcott sighed. "Manners ain't the same as feeling, child. Trust me when I tell you that man's heart is long dead and buried." Francine thought about those words as she made her way back to her father's small house at the edge of town. She'd learned to be cautious of town gossip, especially in places like Fort Kearny, where entertainment often came in the form of speculation about one's neighbors. Her father was sleeping when she entered, his breathing labored but steady. "At 58, Doctor." Harold Shaw looked 20 years older, consumed by the disease that had taken his wife years earlier. The journey west had been his last hope, but Francine was beginning to fear it had only hastened his decline. "Is that you, Francine?" he called weakly from his bedroom. "Yes, Papa," she answered, setting down her things and moving to his side. "How are you feeling today?" He waved away her concern. "Better, much better. Did you finish your sketches of the town square?" She smiled, knowing he asked only to distract her from worrying. "Nearly." There was a small disturbance, nothing serious. Her father had been Fort Kearny's doctor for the brief months after their arrival when his health still permitted it. Now, Francine supported them by selling her sketches to travelers and taking in mending. Her father's small pension and savings would not last forever. "I had a visitor while you were out," her father said, pushing himself to sit up against his pillows. "Mr. Montgomery from the Crescent Ridge." Francine's eyebrows rose in surprise. "The cattle rancher, whatever for." "He heard I was a doctor. Came to ask about a remedy for colic, not for himself," he added with a small smile. "For a foal. I gave him what advice I could. Seems a decent sort if rather contained." "That's not what the town says about him," Francine replied, pouring her father a glass of water. "Ah, yes. The infamous town opinion." Her father chuckled, which turned into a cough. When he recovered, he continued, "They say he can't love, can't feel. I've heard it too, but there's always more to people than gossip would have us believe." Francine nodded absently, her mind returning to those piercing blue eyes. "Mrs. Wilcott mentioned he lost his wife." "Yes, during the war years. Terrible business." Her father took a sip of water. "He's offering work, by the way." "Work? What kind of work?" "His housekeeper is leaving, getting married and moving to California. He needs someone to cook and keep house at the ranch. I suggested you might be interested." "Papa," Francine exclaimed, "I know nothing about ranch work, and besides, I couldn't leave you alone." Her father's face grew serious. "You can't spend your days nursing me forever, my dear. I've arranged for Mrs. Jenkins to come by daily. The pay Mr. Montgomery is offering is more than fair, far more than your sketches bring in, as lovely as they are." Francine felt a flutter of anxiety. "I don't know." "Just meet with him," her father urged gently. "He'll be back tomorrow to hear your answer. We need the money, Francine, and you need a life beyond these four walls." She couldn't argue with either point. Their savings were dwindling, and the cost of her father's medicines was substantial. And though she'd never admit it to him, the prospect of spending her days in the wider world rather than their small house held undeniable appeal. "Very well," she conceded. "I'll speak with him tomorrow." That night, Francine lay awake, listening to her father's labored breathing from the next room. She thought of Beau Montgomery, wondering what kind of employer he would be. Cold and demanding, distant but fair. The man was a mystery, wrapped in rumors and speculation. Her thoughts drifted to what Mrs. Wilcott had said about hearts that break. Francine knew something about that herself, having lost her mother to the same wasting disease that now claimed her father. But she'd never considered shutting herself off from feeling as a response to pain. The very idea seemed impossible to her. When morning came, Francine dressed with particular care in her best day dress, a simple but well-made garment of forest green. She pinned her honey-brown hair into a neat bun, studying her reflection critically. At 24, she was past the age when most women in Fort Kearny were married with children, but her father's illness had consumed her attention these past years. "You look lovely," her father commented as she brought him his morning medicine. "Quite the professional housekeeper." She smiled despite her nervousness. "I'm not certain I'll take the position, Papa." "Of course not," he replied, though his tone suggested he believed otherwise. "But it never hurts to make a good impression." Montgomery arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. The sharp knock at their door sent Francine's heart racing inexplicably. She smoothed her skirts and opened the door to find him standing on their small porch, hat in hand. Up close, he was even more imposing. Tall and broad-shouldered, with features that might have been handsome if not set in such stern lines. His dark hair was cut short, and those striking blue eyes regarded her with careful assessment. "Miss Shaw," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Your father said you might be interested in the position at Crescent Ridge." "Please come in, Mr. Montgomery," she replied, stepping aside. "My father is resting, but we can speak in the parlor." He nodded, ducking slightly to enter their modest home. In the small parlor, he seemed to fill the space, making everything else appear diminished. He declined her offer of coffee or tea, sitting only when she took her seat. "The position is straightforward," he began without preamble. "Cooking, cleaning, mending. The ranch house isn't large, but it requires upkeep. You'd have Sundays to yourself and could visit town or your father then. The pay is $15 a month, plus room and board." Francine blinked at the sum, nearly triple what she earned from her sketches and mending combined. "That's very generous," she managed. Something flickered across his face. "Good help is hard to find out here, Miss Shaw. I value competence and reliability." "May I ask why your current housekeeper is leaving?" "Mrs. Daniels is marrying a storekeeper in Sacramento. She's been with me 3 years." Francine considered her next words carefully. "And the nature of the household, Mr. Montgomery? I understand you live alone." His expression didn't change, but she sensed a slight tension in his shoulders. "I do. There are 3 ranch hands who work the property, but they have their own quarters some distance from the main house. If you're concerned about propriety, Miss Shaw, I assure you your reputation would not suffer. Mrs. Daniels can vouch for my character, as can Sheriff Porter." "I didn't mean to imply—" "You're right to ask," he interrupted, not unkindly. "A woman alone should be cautious, but I run a respectable operation, Miss Shaw. You would be treated with nothing but respect." She believed him, though she couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was the straightforward way he spoke, without charm or persuasion. "How soon would you need me to start?" she asked. "Mrs. Daniels leaves at the end of the week. You could come Saturday if that suits." Francine nodded slowly. "I would need to arrange care for my father." "Your father mentioned Mrs. Jenkins. She's a good woman. I can speak to her myself if you'd like, ensure she understands the importance of his care." The offer surprised her. It was considerate in a practical way, and she hadn't expected even that much from him. "Thank you. That would be helpful." She hesitated. "Mr. Montgomery, I should tell you that I have limited experience as a housekeeper. I can cook basic meals and keep a tidy home, but can you learn?" he asked simply. "Yes, of course." "Then that's all I require." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll return Friday with the wagon to collect you and your things. If you change your mind before then, send word with anyone heading toward Crescent Ridge." As she showed him to the door, a question burned on her tongue. "Mr. Montgomery," she began, then faltered. He turned, waiting. "The town. People say certain things about you." She felt her cheeks warm. "I don't generally put stock in gossip, but what do they say, Miss Shaw?" His tone was flat, but his eyes had sharpened. She swallowed. "That you're cold, unfeeling." For a long moment he said nothing, his face impassive. Then, "Do you believe everything you hear, Miss Shaw?" "No," she answered honestly. "But I believe in knowing who I'm working for." A ghost of something respect perhaps flashed across his face. "I pay well, I treat people fairly, and I mind my business. Beyond that, what I feel or don't feel isn't relevant to the position. Good day, Miss Shaw." With that, he was gone, leaving Francine staring after him with a mixture of trepidation and fascination. She wasn't sure what impulse had prompted her to confront him with the town's gossip, but his response had been illuminating in its own way. That evening, as she discussed the position with her father, he seemed pleased with her decision. "Beau Montgomery is a fair man," he said confidently. "Hard, perhaps, but not cruel. You'll be safe there, which is what matters most to me." "You speak as if you know him well," Francine observed, tucking the blanket around her father's thin frame. Her father smiled faintly. "I've treated enough patients to recognize the difference between a man who feels nothing and one who feels too much. Montgomery falls into the latter category, I suspect." Francine wasn't sure she agreed, but she trusted her father's judgment. By the time Friday arrived, she had packed her modest belongings, arranged with Mrs. Jenkins for her father's care, and steeled herself for the change ahead. Montgomery arrived precisely when he said he would, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by two well-kept horses. He helped load her trunk and the few items she was bringing, then assisted her father into the wagon as well. Francine had insisted her father come to see where she would be living. The journey to Crescent Ridge took nearly 2 hours. As they left the boundaries of Fort Kearny behind, the landscape opened up into rolling prairie dotted with wildflowers and the occasional copse of trees. In the distance, a herd of cattle grazed, tiny dark specks against the green and gold of the plains. "It's beautiful," Francine murmured, almost to herself. "It is," Montgomery agreed, surprising her. She glanced at him, but his eyes remained fixed on the trail ahead, his profile sharp against the blue sky. Crescent Ridge Ranch came into view as they crested a small rise. The main house was larger than Francine had expected, a solidly built 2-story structure of timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, and a corral held a number of horses. Beyond, the land stretched toward distant hills, marked by the meandering line of a creek. "This is all yours?" she couldn't help asking. 800 acres, he replied. "Not as large as some spreads, but good land." He helped her father down first when they reached the house, then offered Francine his hand. His touch was brief but steady, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "Mrs. Daniels greeted them at the door, a plump, pleasant woman in her 40s, who immediately took charge of showing Francine around while Montgomery helped her father to a comfortable chair on the porch. The house was plain but well-maintained, with solid furniture and practical arrangements. The kitchen was unexpectedly well-equipped, with a good stove and ample storage. Upstairs, Mrs. Daniels showed Francine to what would be her room, a modest but comfortable chamber with a bed, dresser, washstand, and small writing desk beneath a window that overlooked the creek. "He's a good employer," Mrs. Daniels told her as they descended the stairs. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair. Pays on time, never raises his voice, respects your work if it's done properly." She lowered her voice. "Don't mind what folks in town say. Mr. Montgomery has his reasons for being as he is." "What reasons?" Francine asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Mrs. Daniels hesitated. "It's not my place to say, miss. Just know that there's more to him than meets the eye." They rejoined the men on the porch, where Montgomery was engaged in quiet conversation with her father. For a moment, Francine was struck by the unlikely tableau they made her frail father animated in discussion with the stern rancher, who was actually listening with what appeared to be genuine interest. "The house meets with your approval?" Montgomery asked as she approached. "It's lovely," she answered truthfully. "Much more comfortable than I expected." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Did you expect a dirt floor and buffalo hides, Miss Shaw?" "No, of course not," she replied, feeling her cheeks warm. "I simply meant—" "I know what you meant," he interrupted, and for a moment she could have sworn the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Mrs. Daniels will show you the rest of your duties before she leaves tomorrow. You can settle in today and begin properly on Monday." With that, he touched his hat and strode off toward one of the outbuildings, leaving Francine with the distinct impression that Beau Montgomery might be more complex than the town, or even she had given him credit for. The next day, Mrs. Daniels departed after a thorough review of household operations. Francine's father returned to town with Montgomery, who had business there. Left alone in the big house, Francine took the opportunity to familiarize herself with every corner of what would now be her domain. The house revealed little about its owner. Unlike most homes, there were few personal touches, no family portraits, no mementos displayed, nothing to suggest the personality of the man who lived there. The only exception was a small shelf in his study that held a few books, mostly practical volumes on cattle breeding and ranch management. But also, surprisingly, a worn copy of Milton's Paradise Lost and a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. By the time Montgomery returned in the late afternoon, Francine had prepared a simple supper and set the dining room table. "You didn't need to cook today," he said, appearing in the doorway as she was stirring a pot of stew. She jumped slightly. For such a large man, he moved remarkably quietly. "I wanted to begin as I mean to go on," she replied. "Besides, we both need to eat." He nodded, then disappeared upstairs, returning a short while later in a clean shirt, his hair damp from washing. They ate in silence at first, the only sounds the clink of utensils against plates and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. "Your father is settled with Mrs. Jenkins," he said eventually. "I made sure she understood his medicine schedule." "Thank you," Francine replied, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "That's very kind." He shrugged slightly as if dismissing the gesture. "It's practical. You'll work better without worrying unnecessarily. Still, I appreciate it." He nodded once, then returned to his meal. Francine studied him surreptitiously as they ate. In the warm light of the dining room, his features seemed less harsh, though no less guarded. The lines around his eyes spoke of long days in the sun, and a thin scar ran along his jawline, barely visible beneath the stubble there. "Is there something on my face, Miss Shaw?" he asked without looking up. Francine flushed, embarrassed at being caught staring. "No, forgive me, I was lost in thought." He met her eyes then, his gaze steady. "You're wondering if the town is right about me." It wasn't a question, and the directness of it startled her. "I try not to judge people based on hearsay, Mr. Montgomery, a wise policy." He set down his fork. "Let me make things simpler for you, Miss Shaw. I hired you to keep my house, not to concern yourself with my temperament or what I may or may not feel. Do your job well, and we'll get along fine." The words weren't unkind, but they established a clear boundary. Francine nodded, understanding the message. Whatever curiosity she felt about Beau Montgomery would have to remain unsatisfied. The days settled into a rhythm. Francine rose early to prepare breakfast and pack a lunch for Montgomery if he was riding out to the far pastures. She cleaned the house, did laundry, mended clothes, and prepared evening meals. Montgomery was often gone from dawn until dusk, returning tired and sometimes muddy from work with the cattle. Their conversations remained practical and brief. He never complained about her cooking or housekeeping, though he offered the occasional suggestion, usually sensible ones that Francine implemented without argument. On Sundays, he drove her into town to visit her father, returning late in the day to collect her. During these visits, she discovered that her father and Montgomery had developed something of a rapport. The rancher often spent an hour in quiet conversation with the ailing doctor, discussing everything from cattle ailments to books they had both read. It was the only time Francine observed Montgomery speaking at any length, and it puzzled her that he seemed more comfortable with her father than with her. As spring blossomed into summer, Francine found herself unexpectedly content with her new life. The work was honest if demanding, and the beauty of Crescent Ridge with its wide skies and rolling hills spoke to something in her soul. She took to sketching in her spare time, capturing the play of light across the prairie or the silhouettes of cattle against the sunset. One evening in early July, as she sat on the porch with her sketchbook, Montgomery returned from a long day of mending fences. He paused at the bottom of the steps, observing her. "You draw well," he commented, nodding toward her sketchbook. Surprised by the personal remark, Francine glanced down at her work, a quick study of a mockingbird perched on the corral fence. "Thank you, it's just a hobby." "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the book. After a moment's hesitation, she handed it to him. He turned the pages slowly, studying each sketch with careful attention: the creek winding through the property, a cluster of wildflowers, the profile of the old ranch hand called Hank smoking his pipe by the barn. "These are more than a hobby, Miss Shaw," he said finally, returning the book. "You have genuine talent." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "My mother taught me. She was quite accomplished." Something flickered in his eyes at the mention of her mother, but he only nodded. "Your father must be proud." "He is, though I think he hoped I'd marry rather than sketch my way through spinsterhood," she said with a small laugh, then immediately wished she could take back the overly personal comment. Montgomery studied her for a long moment. "You're hardly in your dotage, Miss Shaw." "I'm 24, she replied. "In a place like Fort Kearny, that's practically ancient for an unmarried woman." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then Fort Kearny lacks imagination. Good evening, Miss Shaw." He disappeared into the house, leaving Francine staring after him, wondering if she had just received a compliment from the supposedly heartless Beau Montgomery. The incident marked a subtle shift in their interactions. Montgomery began to join her on the porch some evenings after supper, sitting in companionable silence as she sketched, and he smoked his pipe. Occasionally, he would comment on her drawings or mention something about the day's work. Small, ordinary exchanges, yet they felt significant in the context of his usual reserve. In mid-July, a violent thunderstorm swept across the prairie. Francine had just finished the supper dishes when the first crash of thunder shook the house. Rain pounded against the windows as lightning split the sky, illuminating the kitchen in stark flashes. She jumped as the back door burst open, admitting a drenched Montgomery and one of the ranch hands, supporting between them a third man, Hank, the elderly cowboy, his face gray with pain. "Lightning spooked his horse," Montgomery explained tersely. "Threw him hard against a fence post, his arms broken, maybe ribs too." They laid the injured man on the kitchen table. Hank moaned, clutching his left arm, which bent at an unnatural angle just below the elbow. "We need a doctor," the ranch hand said anxiously. "No time," Montgomery replied. "Storms washed out the creek crossing. We can't get to town until it subsides." He turned to Francine. "Your father taught you anything about setting bones?" She swallowed hard. "Some. I assisted him occasionally." "Then you know more than any of us. Can you help him?" The question wasn't really a question, it was a statement of necessity. Francine nodded, already rolling up her sleeves. "I'll need clean linens, something to use as a splint, and whiskey both for him and to clean the wound if the skin is broken." Montgomery moved instantly, gathering what she needed while instructing the other ranch hand to heat water. Francine spoke soothingly to Hank, examining his injury with as gentle a touch as she could manage. "It's a clean break," she told him. "I can feel it. We need to set it before swelling makes it worse." She looked up at Montgomery. "I'll need you to hold him steady. This will hurt." Montgomery nodded, positioning himself at Hank's shoulders. The other ranch hand held the old cowboy's legs. Francine took a deep breath, mentally reviewing what her father had taught her about setting broken bones. "On three," she said, gripping Hank's arm firmly. "1, 2. She pulled sharply before saying 3, aligning the broken bone with a sickening sound. Hank's scream cut through the storm noise, then he fell silent, mercifully unconscious. Working quickly, Francine splinted and bound the arm, then examined his ribs. "2 broken here," she said, her fingers probing gently. "Maybe 3. We need to bind his chest." Together, she and Montgomery wrapped Hank's torso tightly with clean bandages. When they finished, the old cowboy was beginning to stir, mumbling incoherently. "He needs laudanum for the pain," Francine said. "Do you have any?" "In the medicine cabinet." "I'll get it." As the storm raged outside, they moved Hank to a bed in the downstairs guest room. Francine administered the laudanum, then sat beside him, monitoring his breathing and occasionally wiping his brow with a cool cloth. Montgomery remained as well, his tall frame propped against the wall, watching both patient and caretaker with careful eyes. "You did well," he said finally, his voice low. "Your father taught you more than some, I'd say." Francine smiled tiredly. "Necessity is an excellent teacher. When Papa became too ill to practice regularly, I had to learn quickly. You have steady hands." It was a simple observation, but something in his tone made it feel like high praise. "Thank you for your help," she replied. "You were quite calm throughout." A shadow crossed his face. "I've seen worse injuries, during the war." It was the first time he had mentioned his past. Francine looked at him curiously. "You fought Union cavalry. 2 years, then Pinkerton work until 65. She wanted to ask more but sensed his reluctance to elaborate. Instead, she said, "My brother joined in 63. He didn't come home." Montgomery's eyes met hers, and in them she saw a flicker of genuine understanding. "I'm sorry. As am I, for whatever you lost." The moment stretched between them, an acknowledgement of shared experience that transcended their usual formality. Then Hank stirred, breaking the spell, and they both turned their attention back to the injured man. By morning, the storm had passed. Hank was feverish but stable, his breathing regular. The creek had receded enough for the other ranch hand to ride for the doctor, who arrived by midday and pronounced Francine's emergency treatment damn fine work for an amateur. That evening, after Hank had been moved to town for proper medical care, Francine found Montgomery on the porch, watching the sunset paint the rain-washed prairie in hues of gold and pink. "Thank you," he said as she joined him, "for saving Hank's arm, possibly his life." "I only did what anyone would do," she replied, settling into the chair beside his. "Not anyone could have done what you did." He turned to look at her directly. "You're a remarkable woman, Francine Shaw." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Before she could respond, he had risen and disappeared back into the house, leaving her with the lingering sensation that something fundamental had shifted between them. The following weeks brought subtle changes. Montgomery began taking his meals with her more regularly, engaging in actual conversation rather than merely responding to direct questions. He spoke of the ranch, of plans to expand his herd, of a new breeding program he hoped would improve the stock. Nothing personal, yet the very fact that he spoke at all felt like a kind of opening. On Sundays, when they visited her father, she noticed Montgomery would often bring small gifts, a book he thought the doctor might enjoy, or a bottle of good whiskey. Her father's health seemed to stabilize somewhat, and Francine suspected it had as much to do with the intellectual stimulation of Montgomery's visits as with any medical treatment. "He's a good man, your Mr. Montgomery," her father remarked one Sunday as they watched the rancher converse with Sheriff Porter outside the general store. "Carries heavy burdens, but carries them well." "He's not my Mr. Montgomery, Papa," Francine protested, feeling her cheeks warm. Her father smiled knowingly. "Perhaps not, but he looks at you when you're not watching. Did you know that?" She hadn't known, and the revelation sent her pulse fluttering in a most disconcerting way. August brought blistering heat to the plains. The creek dwindled to a trickle, and the cattle grew restless, seeking what little shade the scattered trees provided. Montgomery and his men worked from before dawn until after dusk, moving the herd to better grazing, ensuring water supplies remained adequate. Francine took to leaving cool drinks on the porch for the men when they returned. One particularly scorching afternoon, she brought a pitcher of lemonade directly to the corral where Montgomery was working with a spirited young colt. He had removed his shirt in the heat, and Francine faltered at the sight of him lean, muscled torso gleaming with sweat, dark hair plastered to his neck. A jagged scar ran across his left shoulder blade, disappearing around his ribs. Battle wound, she guessed, from the war he so rarely mentioned. He turned as she approached, reaching for his shirt draped over the fence. "Miss Shaw," he acknowledged, pulling it on but leaving it unbuttoned. "Something wrong at the house?" "No," she replied, willing her voice to remain steady. "I thought you might appreciate something cold to drink." He accepted the glass she offered, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thoughtful of you." He drained it in several long swallows, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "It's too hot for you to be out here. You should be inside." "I don't mind the heat," she said, though in truth her dress was sticking uncomfortably to her skin. "The colt is coming along well." Montgomery glanced at the young horse, now prancing around the corral. "He's got spirit, good bloodlines too." He studied her for a moment. "You're fond of horses?" "Very much. My grandfather raised them in Pennsylvania before the war." She smiled at the memory. "He taught me to ride when I was barely big enough to reach the stirrups." "You never mentioned you could ride." Francine shrugged slightly. "You never asked. Besides, it's been years." He seemed to consider something, then nodded decisively. "I have a gentle mare that would suit you, if you'd like to ride sometime. The view from the North Ridge is worth seeing." The offer surprised her. "I'd like that very much." 3 days later, Montgomery kept his word. He appeared at the house just after breakfast, leading 2 saddled horses, his own chestnut stallion and a pretty dappled gray mare. "If you're not too busy," he said, something almost hesitant in his manner. Francine had worn her split riding skirt in anticipation, having mended it the previous evening. "I've finished the essential chores," she replied, trying to contain her excitement. He helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The mare was indeed gentle, responding easily to Francine's commands, despite her years of absence from the saddle. They rode at an easy pace, Montgomery occasionally pointing out features of the landscape, a hawk's nest in a distant tree, a prairie dog town bustling with activity, the tracks of a deer crossing their path. The North Ridge offered a spectacular view, just as he'd promised. The prairie stretched before them in a patchwork of gold and green, the distant hills shimmering in the summer haze. Far below, the creek glinted like a silver thread, and beyond it, the Crescent Ridge buildings looked like toys arranged by a child's hand. "It's breathtaking," Francine said softly, drinking in the vista. Montgomery nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "First time I saw this land, I knew I'd found home. Bought the initial parcel with my Pinkerton savings in '65. Added to it since then." "You've built something remarkable," she told him sincerely. He shrugged slightly, but she could see the pride in his eyes. "It's a good spread. Will be better when I implement the new breeding program." He hesitated, then added, "For whoever inherits it someday." The comment hung in the air between them. Did he mean children? A wife? Francine wasn't sure, and she didn't feel she could ask. Instead, she said, "Thank you for showing me this. I'd like to sketch it sometime if you wouldn't mind." "Bring your sketchbook next time," he replied, and the promise of next time warmed her more than the summer sun. They rode several times over the following weeks, exploring different parts of the ranch. Montgomery proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out native plants and wildlife, explaining his plans for various sections of the property. During these rides, he seemed more relaxed than at any other time, as if the open spaces allowed him to breathe more freely. Francine began to recognize that what the town had interpreted as coldness was actually a deep reserve, a careful containment of emotions, rather than an absence of them. She caught glimpses of the man beneath the stern exterior. His quiet satisfaction when a difficult calf was born healthy, his unexpectedly gentle way with frightened animals, his dry humor that emerged in rare, understated comments. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon, Montgomery surprised her by asking about her life before Fort Kearny. "Were you ever engaged? Back east?" The personal question startled her. "Once," she admitted. "Before the war. A doctor who studied with my father." "What happened?" She smiled wryly. "He decided a doctor's wife should be decorative rather than useful, said my tendency to speak my mind would embarrass him with patients." Montgomery's expression darkened. "Sounds like a fool." "Oh, he was quite intelligent," Francine replied lightly. "Just traditional in his views. And perhaps he was right. I've never been particularly skilled at holding my tongue when I should." "Some might consider that a virtue rather than a failing," Montgomery said quietly. Their eyes met in the gathering dusk, and Francine felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of mutual respect that had grown into something warmer. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a rider, one of Montgomery's hands, with news that cattle had broken through a fence in the south pasture. Montgomery rose immediately, the brief moment of openness replaced by his usual focused demeanor. "Don't wait up," he told her, already striding toward the barn. She watched him go, wondering at the curious mixture of strength and sensitivity she was beginning to discern in Beau Montgomery, and at her own growing feelings for a man the town believed incapable of love. September brought cooler temperatures and preparations for winter. Hay was cut and stored, cattle were moved to more sheltered pastures, and the house required weatherproofing against the coming cold. Francine threw herself into these tasks with energy, determined to prove her worth beyond mere cooking and cleaning. One morning, as she was sealing drafty windows with strips of cloth, Montgomery appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, observing her work. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I can hire someone from town." Francine shook her head, not pausing in her task. "There's no need. My mother taught me how to weatherproof a house properly. Besides, I live here too. I prefer not to freeze this winter." He watched her for a moment longer. "You're not what I expected, Francine Shaw." She glanced up at that, surprised again by his use of her first name. "Is that good or bad, Mr. Montgomery?" "Beau," he said. "If we're to use first names." "Beau," she repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on her tongue. "You didn't answer my question." A slight smile touched his lips. "Good. Decidedly good." Before she could respond, he had disappeared down the hallway, leaving Francine with a curious fluttering in her chest that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. That evening, a letter arrived from town. Her father's condition had worsened suddenly. Mrs. Jenkins was concerned he might not last the night. Beau didn't hesitate. Despite the late hour and threatening weather, he hitched the wagon and drove Francine to town himself, pushing the horses as fast as safety allowed. They reached her father's house to find the doctor already there, his expression grave. "Pneumonia," he told Francine quietly. "His lungs were already so weak. I've given him morphine for the pain, but I'm afraid there's little else to be done." Francine sat beside her father through the night, holding his thin hand as his breathing grew increasingly labored. Beau remained as well, a steady presence in the corner of the room, speaking occasionally with the doctor in low tones, but mostly keeping silent vigil alongside her. Just before dawn, Harold Shaw opened his eyes one last time, fixing them on his daughter's face. "My brave girl," he whispered. "You'll be all right now." His gaze shifted beyond her to where Beau stood, and something passed between the two men, an understanding or agreement that Francine couldn't interpret. Then her father's eyes closed, and with a soft exhalation, he was gone. The days that followed passed in a blur of arrangements and grief. Beau handled most of the practical matters: the coffin, the burial plot, the minister. The town turned out in surprising numbers for the funeral, a testament to the respect Harold Shaw had earned in his brief time in Fort Kearny. As the last of the mourners departed the small cemetery, Francine stood alone by the fresh grave, numb with exhaustion and loss. She sensed rather than heard Beau approach, his solid presence a comfort in her peripheral vision. "I keep thinking of things to tell him," she said softly. "Little things about the ranch or a sketch I'm working on. Then I remember." "I know," he replied simply. Of course he did, she realized. He had lost his wife, perhaps others as well. He understood grief in a way most people merely observed. "What do I do now?" The question wasn't really meant for him, more a wondering aloud, but he answered anyway. "You keep going, one day at a time. It gets, not easier exactly, but more manageable." She nodded, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Without a word, Beau offered his handkerchief. The simple gesture broke something in her, and suddenly she was sobbing deep, wrenching cries that seemed to come from the very core of her being. Strong arms enfolded her, drawing her against a broad chest. Beau held her as she wept, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other steady at her waist. He said nothing, made no attempt to hush her or offer platitudes. He simply held her, solid as stone, while the storm of her grief broke over them both. When her tears finally subsided, Francine became acutely aware of their position, of her face pressed against his shirt, of his hand tangled in her hair, of the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. She stepped back reluctantly, wiping her face with his now sodden handkerchief. "Forgive me," she murmured. "I didn't mean to." "There's nothing to forgive," he interrupted gently. "Grief demands expression, Francine, better tears than silence." She looked up at him then, really looked, and saw in his blue eyes a depth of understanding that could only come from experience. Whatever he had suffered, he knew the contours of loss as intimately as she did. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." He nodded once, then offered his arm. "Come, it's getting cold." They walked back to town in companionable silence, arm in arm. Francine knew there would be talk: the cold-hearted rancher and the doctor's daughter, alone at the cemetery long after the others had gone. But in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to care what Fort Kearny might say. The weeks following her father's death were difficult. Francine threw herself into work at the ranch, rising earlier and retiring later, as if physical exhaustion might somehow mitigate her grief. Beau watched her with concern but said little. respecting her process even as he quietly adjusted his own routines to match hers, appearing in the kitchen for early breakfasts he didn't usually take, finding tasks around the house in the evenings rather than retiring to his study. October arrived with frost on the prairie grass and geese flying south in V formations overhead. The cattle were moved to winter pastures, and the ranch settled into a slower rhythm. One evening, as Francine prepared supper, Beau appeared in the kitchen doorway with an unexpected announcement. "I need to go to Omaha on business. Cattle buyer wants to negotiate a contract for spring calves." Francine nodded, continuing to knead bread dough. "When will you leave?" "Tomorrow, if the weather holds. I'll be gone about 2 weeks." He hesitated. "Will you be all right here alone?" She looked up, surprised by the question. "Of course, the ranch hands are nearby if I need anything." "It's not that." He frowned slightly. "You've been since your father." "I'm fine," she assured him, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "The work helps, keeps me busy." He studied her for a long moment. "I could postpone the trip." The offer touched her deeply. "No need. Your business is important, and truly I'll be fine. The solitude might do me good." He nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "I've spoken to Hank. He'll check on you daily." "That's not necessary, please," he interrupted. "For my peace of mind." Something in his tone made her relent. "Very well, for your peace of mind." The following morning, Beau departed before dawn. The house felt strangely empty without his presence, though he had never been particularly talkative or demonstrative. Francine realized with some surprise how accustomed she had grown to his quiet company, to the sound of his boots on the wooden floors, to his deep voice asking about her day. True to his word, Hank checked on her daily, usually around midday. The old cowboy was still recovering from his injuries, but mobile enough to make the short ride from the bunkhouse. They would share coffee, Francine asking about the cattle and Hank inquiring after her health in his gruff but kindly way. On the 5th day of Beau's absence, Hank arrived with unexpected news. "Letter came for you," he said, handing her an envelope. "Ryder brought it from town." Francine examined the unfamiliar handwriting with curiosity. Opening it, she found a formal letter from a solicitor in Pennsylvania, her mother's cousin, a man she barely remembered. He wrote that her maternal grandmother had passed away, leaving Francine a small inheritance, $300 and a collection of family jewelry. "Not bad news, I hope?" Hank asked, noting her expression. "My grandmother died," she explained. "I hadn't seen her in many years, but still." "Another loss," Hank said with surprising gentleness. "You've had your share lately," she smiled sadly. "Life seems to deliver them in clusters sometimes." Hank nodded sagely. "The boss knows something about that. Lost his wife and baby during the war, then his brother at Gettysburg, parents to fever year after. Man's had more grief than most." Francine hadn't known about Beau's brother or parents. The knowledge deepened her understanding of the man she had come to. What? Respect. Admire. The feeling was more complex than either word suggested. "He never speaks of them," she said softly. "Ain't his way." Hank sipped his coffee. "But don't let that fool you into thinking he don't feel it. I seen him ride out on his wife's birthday each year. Comes back looking like he fought the war all over again." The image struck Francine's heart with unexpected force. She thought of Beau alone with his grief, year after year, bearing it in silence because that was his way. "The town thinks he can't feel," she murmured, almost to herself. Hank snorted. "Town's full of fools. Boss feels plenty. Just learn to keep it buttoned up tight." He eyed her shrewdly. "You seem different, though, ain't that right?" Francine felt her cheeks warm. "I've seen a man who's been kind to me during the worst moments of my life. Who treats his animals and his workers with respect. Who reads poetry when he thinks no one is watching." Hank grinned. Don't tell him I told you none of this. He'd have my hide. Your secret is safe with me, she promised. After Hank left, Francine found herself restless. The conversation had stirred something in her, a deeper curiosity about Beau Montgomery, and a growing awareness of her own feelings toward him. She wandered into his study, telling herself she merely needed a book to read, but finding her eyes drawn to the desk where he kept his accounts. A small drawer was partially open, unusual for the meticulously organized rancher. Intending only to close it properly, Francine noticed a corner of what appeared to be a photograph protruding from the gap. Without conscious decision, she found herself pulling the drawer open further. Inside lay a daguerreotype in a simple silver frame. It showed a young woman with dark hair and a serious expression, seated beside a uniformed Beau, younger, less weathered, but recognizable by those striking blue eyes. His wife, Francine realized, the woman whose loss had shaped him so profoundly. She started to close the drawer, ashamed of her intrusion, when something else caught her eye, a small leather pouch. Its drawstring was loose, revealing a glimpse of what appeared to be a tiny knitted booty. The babies, she thought with a pang. The child lost with its mother. Hastily, Francine closed the drawer completely, her heart aching for the younger Beau who had lost his family in a single devastating blow. No wonder the town thought him heartless. What man could endure such loss without building walls around what remained? The days of Beau's absence seemed to stretch endlessly. Francine kept busy with household tasks, took occasional rides on the gray mare, and sketched the changing landscape as autumn painted the prairie in russets and golds. But her thoughts returned constantly to Beau, to the complexities she was discovering beneath his reserved exterior, to the growing tenderness she felt toward him. On the 12th day, an early winter storm swept in from the north. Sleet rattled against the windows, driven by howling winds that found every crack in the weatherproofing. Francine built up the fires and wrapped herself in a quilt, hoping the ranch hands had secured the cattle in sheltered pastures as Beau had planned. By evening, the sleet had turned to snow, accumulating rapidly in drifts against the house. Francine had just lit the lamps when a pounding at the door startled her. Thinking it must be Hank with news about the cattle, she hurried to answer. Instead, she found Beau on the porch, snow-covered and half-frozen, his face tight with exhaustion. "You're back," she exclaimed, ushering him inside. "I wasn't expecting you for another day at least." "Saw the storm coming," he replied, shrugging off his ice-encrusted coat. "Rode ahead of it as far as I could, but it caught me about 5 miles out." He stamped his boots, sending snow cascading onto the entry rug. "Damn near froze crossing the creek." Francine immediately took charge, urging him toward the fire in the sitting room. "You need to get warm." "I'll fetch dry clothes and something hot to drink." When she returned with coffee and clean garments, he had removed his wet boots and was standing dangerously close to the fireplace, his body still racked with occasional shivers. "Here," she said, handing him the steaming mug. "Drink this while it's hot. I've added a splash of whiskey." He accepted gratefully, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. They were like ice. Without thinking, Francine captured his free hand between both of hers, rubbing it briskly to restore circulation. "Your hands are freezing," she murmured. "How long were you out in that?" "Hours," he admitted. "Horse nearly gave out 1/2 mile from the house. Had to walk him the rest of the way." Francine continued warming his hand, noting with concern how red and chapped his skin was, early signs of frostbite. "You should change into these dry clothes. I'll prepare a hot meal while you warm up properly." He nodded, but made no move to take the clothes or release his hand from hers. Instead, he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, intense, questioning, almost vulnerable. "I was worried about you," he said finally. "During the storm." The admission surprised her. "About me? I was perfectly safe here, I know, still worried." He took a deep breath. "Seems I've grown accustomed to having you here, Francine Shaw." There was something in his voice, a warmth that belied his still chilled exterior. Francine felt her heart quicken, but before she could respond, he had set down his mug and taken the dry clothes from her. "I'll change," he said, his usual reserve returning like a shield. "Thank you for the coffee." Later, after he had eaten and his color had returned to normal, they sat before the fire as the storm raged outside. Beau spoke of his business in Omaha, the cattle contract he'd secured, supplies he'd purchased for the ranch, news from the larger world beyond Fort Kearny. "The railroad's pushing west faster than expected," he told her. "They'll reach Fort Kearny by spring, they say. Change everything for ranchers like me, no more long cattle drives. Just load them on trains and ship them east." "Is that good for your business?" she asked, genuinely interested. He considered. "Good for profits. Less risk than drives, but there's something to be said for the old ways, too." He stared into the fire. "Progress isn't always an improvement. You prefer tradition. I prefer what works." He glanced at her. "But I'm not opposed to change when it's warranted." She felt there was more to his words than cattle and railroads, but couldn't quite grasp the subtext. Instead, she asked about his family home in the East, a subject he'd never mentioned before. To her surprise, he answered readily, describing a modest farm in western Pennsylvania where he'd grown up with his brother and parents. "Nothing grand," he said, "but good land, good people. Father was a schoolmaster originally, taught us both to read and cipher before we ever saw a proper school." "Is that why you have Milton and Shakespeare in your study?" she asked, then immediately regretted revealing her knowledge of his private space. But Beau only nodded. "Father believed education elevated the mind. Mother preferred more practical applications. She taught us to track game, to read weather patterns, to use plants for medicine." "They sound like remarkable people." "They were." His expression softened slightly. "They would have liked you, I think." The comment warmed her more than the fire. "Tell me about your brother," she prompted gently. A shadow crossed his face. "Benjamin, 2 years younger, better man than me in most ways, kinder, more patient." He paused. "He was a medic. Died trying to reach wounded men during the fighting at Gettysburg." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "My brother Jacob died at Chancellorsville. He was 21. Beau nodded, understanding in his eyes. "War takes the best of us, leaves the rest to carry on somehow." "Is that how you see yourself?" "As the rest?" The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Sometimes. After Elizabeth and the baby died, for a long time, yes." "And now?" she asked, scarcely breathing. His eyes met hers across the space between their chairs. "Now I'm not so sure." The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Then a log shifted in the grate, sending up a shower of sparks, and Beau rose abruptly. "It's late," he said. "We should both get some rest." "Storm might keep us housebound tomorrow." Francine nodded, recognizing his retreat even as she felt disappointed by it. "Good night, Beau." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that made her heart skip. "Good night, Francine." The storm continued through the night and into the next day. As Beau had predicted, they were effectively housebound, the drifts too deep for safe travel even to the barn. The ranch hands would be caring for the animals, he assured her, having prepared for just such weather. They spent the day in surprisingly comfortable domesticity. Beau worked on his accounts at the kitchen table while Francine baked bread and prepared meals. Occasionally, they exchanged comments about the weather or ranch matters, but mostly they existed in a companionable silence that required no filling. By evening, the storm had begun to abate, the wind dropping to occasional gusts rather than constant howling. After supper, they again took their places before the fire in the sitting room. Francine had brought her sketchbook, working on a drawing of the snow-draped corral visible from the window. "May I see?" Beau asked after watching her work for some time. She handed him the book, suddenly self-conscious. He studied the sketch carefully, then turned the page to examine others she had drawn during his absence: the gray mare grazing in the pasture, Hank smoking his pipe on the porch, a red-tailed hawk perched on the barn roof. "These are excellent," he said with genuine admiration. "You capture more than just appearances. There's feeling in them." "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I filled another book with sketches of the ranch this summer. I could show you sometime if you'd like." He nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. "I would." He turned another page and stopped, his expression changing. Francine realized with a jolt that he was looking at a sketch she had done from memory: Beau himself, mounted on his chestnut stallion against the backdrop of the North Ridge. She had drawn him in profile, his face lifted to the horizon, a rare moment of openness captured in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his head. "When did you draw this?" he asked quietly. "Last week," she admitted. "From memory, I hope you don't mind." He studied the image for a long moment. "Is this how you see me?" The question seemed to ask more than its simple words suggested. Francine considered carefully before answering. "I see a man who has built something meaningful from loss, who treats others with fairness and respect, who loves this land and the life he's created here." She paused, gathering her courage. "A man who feels deeply, whatever the town might believe." Beau's eyes lifted from the sketch to her face, searching. "The town isn't entirely wrong. There was a time after Elizabeth died when I couldn't feel anything, didn't want to." He set the sketchbook aside. "Grief can hollow a person out, leave nothing but emptiness." "But you're not empty now," she said softly. "It wasn't a question." "No." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Not anymore." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Francine felt her heart quicken, hope and uncertainty warring within her. "Beau," she began, not entirely sure what she meant to say. He rose suddenly, crossing to the window to stare out at the snow-covered landscape. His back was to her, shoulders tense beneath his shirt. "I never intended this," he said, his voice low. "When I hired you, it was for your competence, nothing more. And now?" she dared to ask. He turned, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Now I find myself thinking of you in ways that go far beyond employer and housekeeper." Francine stood, moving to join him by the window. "Is that so terrible?" "It could be," he replied. "For both of us. You deserve better than a man the town calls heartless." "I don't care what the town says." She took a step closer. "I care what I know." "And what do you know, Francine?" The question was almost a challenge. "I know you're a good man who has suffered great loss. I know you built walls to protect what remained of your heart." She reached out tentatively, laying her palm against his chest. "And I know that heart still beats, still feels, still has room for more than memories." For a moment he stood perfectly still. Then slowly, he covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his chest. "More than memories," he repeated quietly. "Yes." His other hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as if she might break or vanish under his fingers. Francine leaned into the contact, her eyes never leaving his. "I've been alone a long time," he murmured. "I'm not sure I remember how to be otherwise." "Perhaps we could learn together," she suggested, scarcely believing her own boldness. Something shifted in his expression, uncertainty giving way to determination. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. His arms encircled her carefully, drawing her against his solid warmth as the kiss deepened, becoming an exploration of feelings too complex for words. When they finally parted, Francine saw in Beau's eyes a mixture of wonder and vulnerability that mirrored her own emotions. Whatever walls had separated them were crumbling, revealing the man behind the stern exterior, a man capable of profound feeling of connection, of love. "Stay with me," he said softly. "Not as my housekeeper, as my wife." The words were so unexpected that for a moment Francine couldn't respond. "Beau, are you certain? This is very sudden." "Nothing about this is sudden," he replied. "I've been falling in love with you since the day you set Hank's arm in the middle of a thunderstorm, maybe before that." He took both her hands in his. "I don't have pretty words or grand gestures, but I can offer you this ranch, my name, and whatever remains of my heart. It's yours if you want it." Tears welled in Francine's eyes. "I want it," she whispered. "I want you, Beau Montgomery, all of you, the strong parts and the broken ones." He pulled her close again, his embrace fierce now, as if he feared she might disappear. "The town won't understand," he warned against her hair. "They'll say I've taken advantage or that you've settled for less than you deserve." "Let them talk," she replied, wrapping her arms around his waist. "We know the truth." The snow continued to fall outside the window, cloaking the world in pristine white, while inside, two people who had known profound loss found their way to each other, discovering that hearts could heal, could open, could love again despite everything. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch. Sheriff Porter stood as witness, along with Hank and a few other ranch hands. Mrs. Wilcott attended as well, her initial disapproval softening when she saw the way Beau looked at his bride as she walked toward him in a simple blue dress with wildflowers in her hair. Fort Kearny buzzed with the news, of course. The cold-hearted rancher and the doctor's daughter, married after a courtship so brief many hadn't even realized it was occurring. Some speculated about hasty motivations, while others wagered on how long such a mismatched union could possibly last. 6 months at most, predicted the blacksmith. "Man like that don't know how to be a proper husband." "Poor girl was desperate after her father died," suggested Mrs. Porter. "Needed security more than love, I expect." But as winter settled over the prairie, the couple at Crescent Ridge paid little heed to town gossip. They were building a life together, day by day, discovering each other's habits and histories, sharing dreams and occasional disagreements that always ended in understanding. Beau taught Francine about cattle breeding and the business of ranching. She introduced him to the joy of sketching, guiding his hand as he attempted to capture the landscape he loved so much. In the evenings, they read aloud from his collection of books, adding new volumes ordered from Omaha or St. Louis. And at night, in the privacy of their bedroom, they discovered the healing power of physical love, Beau's initial hesitancy giving way to passionate tenderness, Francine's natural responsiveness helping him remember what it meant to be truly connected to another person. By spring, when the promised railroad finally reached Fort Kearny, bringing new settlers and increased business, the gossip about the Montgomerys had largely subsided. Occasional visitors to the ranch reported with surprise that the supposedly heartless rancher seemed almost content, while his wife bloomed like a wildflower after rain. In April, Francine confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was expecting a child. Beau's reaction to the news revealed how far he had come from the man who couldn't feel. Joy warred with fear on his face, joy for the new life they had created, fear of losing this second chance at fatherhood as he had lost his first. "It will be different this time," Francine assured him, holding his trembling hands. "I'm strong and healthy. We'll take every precaution." He nodded, pulling her close. "I can't lose you," he whispered against her hair. "Either of you." "You won't," she promised, though they both knew such promises were beyond any human's power to keep absolutely. "We'll face whatever comes together." As Francine's body changed with the growing child, Beau became increasingly protective, insisting she rest frequently and hiring additional help for the house. He sent for a doctor from Omaha who specialized in difficult births, arranging for the man to stay in Fort Kearny for the month surrounding Francine's due date. "You're being ridiculous," she told him with fond exasperation. "Women have babies every day without such fuss." "Not my wife," he replied firmly. "Not my child. We're taking no chances." By late autumn, with the baby due any day, Beau had worked himself into such a state of anxiety that even Hank commented on it. "Boss is wearing a path in the porch boards," the old cowboy told Francine. "Never seen a man so tied in knots over a natural occurrence." "He has reason," Francine replied gently, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "His first wife." Hank nodded, understanding. "Different circumstances," he said with unexpected wisdom. "Different woman, different outcome." She was in the kitchen, preserving the last of the garden vegetables when the first pains began. Mild at first, they gradually increased in intensity until she was forced to stop working, gripping the edge of the table as a particularly strong contraction washed over her. Beau found her there, her face pale but determined. One look was enough for him to understand. "It's time," he asked, his voice tight with concern. She nodded. "Early stages still. There's no need to panic." But panic he did in his controlled Montgomery way. Within an hour, the doctor had been summoned, the bedroom prepared, and the ranch hands dispatched to various tasks that would keep them well away from the house. The labor progressed normally, according to the doctor, painful but uncomplicated. Francine endured each contraction with quiet determination, drawing strength from Beau's unwavering presence. Unlike most men, who preferred to wait elsewhere during childbirth, he refused to leave her side, holding her hand and wiping her brow as the hours passed. As dawn broke over the prairie, turning the frost-covered grass to gold, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the ranch house. The doctor cleaned and swaddled the infant before placing him in Francine's tired arms. "A fine boy," he pronounced. "Strong lungs, good color. Mother's doing well, too," he added for Beau's benefit. "No complications." Beau stood frozen at the bedside, staring at the small bundle in his wife's arms as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Francine recognized the emotions warring on his face: joy and terror, love and painful memory. "Would you like to hold your son?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then carefully took the child, cradling him with hands that had broken wild horses and built fences, but now trembled slightly with the precious weight they held. The baby's eyes were closed, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. Beau studied him with wonder, taking in every detail: the dusting of dark hair, the perfectly formed fingers, the bow-shaped mouth so like Francine's. "He's beautiful," he whispered. "Perfect. We should name him," Francine suggested, watching the transformation on her husband's face. Beau nodded slowly. "Benjamin," he said after a moment, "for my brother, if that's all right with you." "Benjamin Harold Montgomery," she agreed. "A good name." The doctor discreetly left the room, leaving the new family to their private moment. Beau sat carefully on the edge of the bed, still holding his sleeping son, his eyes never leaving the child's face. "I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted quietly. A family. After Elizabeth and the baby died, I convinced myself it was better not to want it, not to need anyone. Francine reached out to touch his arm. And now, he looked up at her, and the love in his eyes was so naked, so unguarded that it took her breath away. Now I need you both more than I can say. You've given me back a part of myself I thought was gone forever. She smiled through tears of exhaustion and happiness. We need you too, Beau. We always will. He leaned forward to kiss her gently, then returned his gaze to their son. As if sensing his father's attention, little Benjamin opened his eyes blue like Beau's, though the doctor said they might change color in the coming months. Father and son regarded each other solemnly for a long moment. Then, to Francine's astonishment, a single tear slipped down Beau's weathered cheek and fell onto the baby's blanket. "Welcome to Crescent Ridge, Benjamin Montgomery," he said softly. "You're home." Word spread quickly through Fort Kearny about the birth of the Montgomery heir. Visitors began arriving at the ranch within days, some out of genuine goodwill. Others from curiosity about the child born to the town's most talked about couple, Mrs. Wilcott was among the first, bringing a hand-knitted blanket and not bothering to disguise her surprise at finding Beau so attentive to both mother and child. "Never thought I'd see the day," she commented to Sheriff Porter afterward. Beau Montgomery changing a baby's diaper and looking pleased about it. "If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." The sheriff smiled. "People can surprise you, Mrs. Wilcott, especially when they find the right reason to change." As Benjamin grew from newborn to infant, it became increasingly clear that fatherhood had transformed Beau in ways the town had never imagined possible. The stern, reserved rancher still drove hard bargains with cattle buyers and managed his spread with efficient precision. But there was a new openness to him, a warmth that was unmistakable to anyone who cared to look. He was often seen carrying his son around the ranch, pointing out horses and cattle, explaining the workings of the property as if the baby could understand every word. In town, he no longer hurried through his business and departed immediately. Instead, he lingered to speak with townspeople, Benjamin secure in his arms or in the wagon beside Francine. Spring arrived again, bringing new calves to the expanding herd and fresh growth to the prairie. Benjamin, now 6 months old, was sitting up on his own, laughing at the antics of the ranch dog and reaching for everything within his grasp. One warm evening, as twilight painted the sky in lavenders and pinks, Francine found Beau and Benjamin on the porch swing. The baby had fallen asleep against his father's chest, tiny fingers curled around one of Beau's calloused thumbs. Beau was gazing down at his son, his expression one of such profound love that Francine paused in the doorway, unwilling to interrupt the moment. Too late, she heard the creak of the floorboard beneath her foot. Beau looked up, catching her watching them. "He's asleep," he whispered unnecessarily. "Wore himself out trying to crawl." Francine smiled, joining them on the swing. "He's determined like his father." Beau chuckled softly. "Stubborn, you mean? Like his mother." She leaned against his shoulder, her family complete within the circle of his arm. "We made something wonderful together, didn't we?" "We did." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And we're just getting started." As if to emphasize his words, Benjamin stirred slightly in his sleep, nestling closer to his father's warmth. Beau's arms tightened protectively around the child, his eyes reflecting the last rays of the setting sun as he gazed at his sleeping son with unmistakable devotion. In that moment, Francine wished the entire town of Fort Kearny could see what she saw, not the cold, heartless rancher of rumor and speculation, but a man whose capacity for love ran as deep as the prairie roots and as vast as the Nebraska sky. What are you thinking? Beau asked softly, noting her contemplative expression. She smiled, reaching out to brush a lock of hair from his forehead. I'm thinking about what the town used to say about you, that you couldn't love. His lips curved in a rare, full smile. They were wrong about a great many things. They were, she agreed, but I always suspected as much, and now I have proof. What proof is that? He asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. Francine's gaze moved from her husband's face to their sleeping child, then back again. I see it every time you look at him, she whispered. Every time you look at me. The town whispered that Beau Montgomery couldn't love, but I saw his eyes when he held our sleeping child. Beau's free hand found hers, fingers intertwining with familiar warmth. Love isn't always loud, he said quietly. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments, the choices we make, the lives we build together. As night settled over Crescent Ridge Ranch, the little family remained on the porch, wrapped in contentment and the knowledge that sometimes the heart's deepest truths are spoken not in words but in tender glances, gentle touches, and the silent promise of tomorrows shared with those we love most in the world.